Imagine this. You've spent your life trusting someone you'd expect to be your rock, your mentor. What if everything you believed about them, about your family, was a lie? Now picture that lie isn't a simple misunderstanding, but a dark, shocking truth that has been hidden from you for decades. This is the story of Daniel Thompson, a preacher from Florida, whose life is upended when he uncovers a revelation so brutal, so devastating, it shatters everything he holds dear. His own father, the man who raised him, is the biological father of his 5 children, a man of God torn apart by a betrayal so unimaginable, it drives him to a place of no return. What happens when the truth cuts deeper than any betrayal, when the weight of your past ignites a horrifying, violent act? Stay tuned as we unravel the devastating story of a preacher's faith, family, and the deadly consequences of a secret that was meant to stay buried. Daniel Thompson was a man of faith, known across his small Florida town for his unwavering devotion to God and his family. A humble preacher, he spent his days delivering sermons that inspired his congregation, teaching them about love, trust, and forgiveness. His community viewed him as a beacon of righteousness, a man whose life reflected the very principles he preached. At home, he was the loving husband to Jessica, his high school sweetheart, and a proud father to their 5 children. From the outside, the Thompsons seemed to have it all. A picture-perfect family, the kind that made people smile and whisper about how lucky they were. They had the house, the car, the kids, everything anyone could want. But what most people didn't see, what most would never imagine, was that behind the closed doors of their home, a storm was quietly building, one that would shake their world to its core. Daniel and Jessica had known each other for years. Their love story was a tale of small-town devotion, one that everyone admired. Their children were their pride and joy, each one a testament to the love they had built together. From school recitals to family picnics, they seemed to live the life that others aspired to. It was a life that embodied the values of family, faith, and community. For years, Daniel's sermons had been the heart of the local church. His words carried weight, his prayers were heartfelt, and his actions matched the message of the gospel he preached. He was a role model, not just within the church, but within the community at large. But underneath the surface of this idyllic family life, things weren't as they seemed. Secrets, buried deep for years, were quietly festering. And it wasn't until one fateful moment, one single discovery, that everything in Daniel's life would change. His world, built on the foundation of trust, faith, and love, would shatter in an instant. The truth, once revealed, would tear apart everything he thought he knew about his family and about his own identity. It all started innocently enough. Daniel, like so many others, decided to take a DNA test. A simple decision, really, one made in the name of curiosity. He had always been interested in his family's roots, wanting to know more about the history that shaped the man he had become. What he thought would be a straightforward exploration of his lineage quickly turned into something far more devastating. Daniel had no way of knowing that this one decision would unravel everything he knew about himself, his family, and the very foundation of his existence. The test came back in the mail one bright, ordinary afternoon. At first, Daniel was excited, eager to uncover secrets hidden in his bloodline. He opened the envelope, glanced at the results. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then his eyes stopped, focused on something strange, something wrong. It was the name on the report. Victor Thompson, his own father, listed as the biological father of all 5 of Daniel's children. A wave of confusion washed over him. He blinked, stared, and blinked again. His mind raced, but nothing made sense. This wasn't possible. His father, his own father, was not only related to him by blood, but now, it seemed, he was linked to his children in a way that no one should ever be. A deep knot tightened in Daniel's stomach, the room around him spinning as he reread the results, each line more disturbing than the last. The implications were unthinkable. How could this be? How could his father, a man he had known and trusted his entire life, be the father of his children? How could his own flesh and blood harbor such a monstrous secret? A secret that had been buried for decades. The horror began to settle in, cold and unyielding, as Daniel's mind tried to piece together a reality that felt like a nightmare. As his fingers trembled over the report, it became all too clear. The family he had believed to be his own, his 5 children, the legacy he had built with his wife, Jessica, was built on lies. His father's betrayal, A betrayal that had festered in the shadows of their lives was now exposed. The years of trust he had placed in Victor, the man who had raised him, the man he had revered, suddenly felt like the cruelest joke. But this was no joke. This was the brutal truth. The DNA didn't lie. Victor Thompson, a man who had always been a pillar in Daniel's life, had fathered every single one of his children. And Daniel was left standing in the wreckage of a life he could no longer recognize. It was an afternoon that Daniel would never forget. The afternoon when his entire world fractured into pieces. The weight of the DNA test revelation had already shattered the fragile foundation of his family. The cold truth hung over him like a storm cloud, suffocating him with every breath. His father had betrayed him. His father had stolen from him in the most unfathomable way possible. And now, his wife, Jessica, she had been complicit in it all. The revelation seemed to twist his very soul, leaving him no longer the man he once was. Unable to contain the overwhelming emotions surging through him, Daniel confronted Jessica. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with years of unspoken truths. Every second stretched into eternity as he demanded the truth. Answers to questions that now seemed so critical, so vital to his shattered existence. He wanted to know how. How could she betray him? How could she be a part of this terrible lie? The words fell from his lips like acid, burning through the calm exterior they had once shared. At first, Jessica hesitated, but when the dam finally broke, the truth poured out in a torrent of regret, guilt, and sorrow. The affair. The one with his father, Victor Thompson. It had started years ago, long before the children were born. Jessica confessed to the illicit relationship, speaking of stolen moments, dark secrets, and forbidden desires. But as her confession hung in the air, something shifted in Daniel. The hurt, the disbelief, the anger, they all morphed into something much darker. His mind, clouded by rage, began to shut down, logic replaced by primal fury. The woman he loved, the mother of his children, she had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. How could she? How could she do this to him? The betrayal cut deeper than anything he could have imagined, and in that moment he snapped. The rage overtook him. He was no longer the preacher, the husband, the father he once was. He was just a man consumed by the cruelest form of vengeance. Without a word, Daniel's fury erupted. In a blinding fit of violence, he attacked Jessica, his mind incapable of processing the full scope of his actions. The world around him ceased to exist. In the space of a few minutes, Daniel's rage turned into a shocking and brutal act. He ended Jessica's life. But that was only the beginning. What followed was unimaginable. Daniel, in his haze of fury and disbelief, committed an act that would haunt him forever. In a moment of unthinkable horror, he dismembered Jessica's body, methodically, cruelly. The brutal violence of it all shocked even the most seasoned investigators. It wasn't just a murder, it was an act of desecration, a violent rejection of the very woman he had once trusted with his heart and soul. Every piece of her, every shred of her being was destroyed in a fit of rage, leaving behind nothing but a scene that would forever be etched in the minds of those who came to witness it. When the authorities arrived at the house, they were met with a sight that would forever be burned into their memories. A house stained with the echoes of what had occurred within its walls. Blood splattered across the floors, walls, and furniture, a cruel reminder of the anger that had consumed Daniel. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, now felt like a tomb. The silence that followed the horrific crime was more deafening than any scream could have been. As the police tape went up, as flashing lights danced in the streets outside, the weight of the crime set in. How could something like this happen? How could a man of faith, a preacher, descend into such darkness? How could a family, seemingly built on love and trust, be torn apart by the kind of violence that even hardened detectives could barely comprehend? Daniel's crime, his brutal, shocking act, had set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. And as the police worked to piece together the fragments of that night, the answer to one question became crystal clear. There was no going back. The man who once stood at the pulpit, preaching love, forgiveness, and faith, was now a murderer. A man who had succumbed to a darkness that no one could have imagined. Within hours, the small town of Arcadia, Florida was rocked to its core. The brutality of the crime seemed almost incomprehensible. How could a man, a respected preacher, commit such a heinous act against his own wife? As police cars sped to the Thompson family home, the authorities could scarcely fathom the horror they would find waiting for them. It was a crime that would send shockwaves through the entire community, shaking the foundation of everything they believed about the man they had trusted to guide them spiritually. The house was nothing short of a crime scene, and it was clear that something monstrous had occurred there. As officers cordoned off the area with yellow tape, the grisly reality of what had transpired began to take shape. Bloodstains painted a gruesome picture of what had unfolded within those walls. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications of a struggle with an intruder. Everything pointed to Daniel Thompson. But why? What would drive a man, a father of 5, a preacher of the gospel, to commit such an unfathomable act? Detectives began their work immediately, starting with the man at the center of it all, Daniel. He was arrested at the scene, his hands stained with the blood of his wife, Jessica. Handcuffed and disoriented, he was led to the police car, his face an unreadable mask of disbelief and devastation. What had driven him to such madness? The questions loomed larger with every passing moment. As the investigation into the crime began, detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the horrific details. Crime scene photographers captured the carnage in stunning detail, each shot revealing just how brutal and violent the crime had been. It wasn't just a murder, it was an act of brutality, a savage destruction of life, a crime that defied understanding. But as the investigation progressed, something far more disturbing began to unfold. What had appeared to be a simple case of a man snapping in a moment of rage quickly transformed into something much darker. Interviews with those closest to Daniel painted a picture of a man whose life had been upended by a family secret so dark it had been buried for decades. They learned of Daniel's recent discovery, the DNA test that had shattered his world. It seemed that the catalyst for the violence was his father, Victor Thompson. It turned out that Daniel's father wasn't just a man of faith. He was the biological father of Daniel's 5 children. The revelation was enough to send Daniel into a fit of uncontrollable rage. But the police needed more than just a confession to understand what had truly transpired. The investigation revealed that this wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was a tangled web of lies, deceit, and betrayal that spanned generations. Daniel's father had not only betrayed him by fathering his children, but his affair with Jessica had remained hidden for years. In the eyes of the law, it seemed clear that Daniel had acted out of pure rage upon discovering the truth. But the detectives soon realized that the truth they had initially uncovered was only the surface of something much more complicated. As investigators combed through the evidence, they discovered shocking details that painted a darker picture of Victor Thompson's role in the family's lives. It wasn't just about one night of passion, it was about years of manipulation and secrecy. How far back did the affair go? How long had Victor been hiding the truth from Daniel? And most disturbingly of all, how long had Daniel unknowingly raised his father's children? The more the detectives uncovered, the more they realized that the truth was elusive, slipping further from their grasp with each new piece of evidence. Interviews with friends, family members, and churchgoers revealed a startling pattern. Daniel had been living in the shadow of this secret for years, unknowingly raising children that weren't biologically his own. This wasn't a simple betrayal, it was a betrayal of a magnitude that no one could have foreseen. Daniel's world had been built on a lie, and that lie had cost him everything. As the investigation unfolded, the police were left with more questions than answers. What had driven Daniel to commit such a brutal act? Was it simply the shock of discovering the truth? Or was there something deeper at play? The detectives began to see the cracks in the seemingly perfect family facade. Beneath the surface of Daniel's life as a preacher, father, and husband, there had been an undercurrent of dark secrets and emotional turmoil that no one could have predicted. Back at the station, Daniel was questioned repeatedly. His demeanor was nothing short of tragic. Eyes hollowed by the weight of the revelation, a man whose entire identity had been ripped away in an instant. But despite his confession, the detectives needed to understand the full scope of the crime, to uncover the depths of the betrayal that had driven him to murder. As Daniel's interrogation continued, the detectives pieced together the timeline of events leading up to that fateful day. His discovery of the DNA test had been the catalyst for the violence, but it was only the final straw in a long line of emotional upheaval. The detectives knew that this was no ordinary crime. It was the result of years of hidden pain, frustration, and betrayal, all culminating in a moment of terrifying violence. The investigation was far from over. The police had only scratched the surface of the true depth of the tragedy that had befallen the Thompson family. What they would uncover in the days to come would shock everyone involved, an intricate web of lies, deceit, and heartbreak that had been concealed for far too long. And the ultimate question remained, could justice truly be served in a case where the truth itself seemed like the most unimaginable betrayal? And the interrogation room was silent. save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Daniel Thompson sat in front of the detectives, his body tense, his hands shaking. His eyes were puffy, red from crying, but no amount of tears could undo the damage that had already been done. The confession had been a long time coming, but now that the truth was out in the open, there was no turning back. The weight of his actions, the brutality of his crime, hung heavy in the air, and the detectives knew it was only a matter of time before Daniel would break. They had the evidence. They had his admission of guilt. But there was one thing left to uncover. Why? Daniel had tried to keep his emotions in check, to hide the storm that raged within him. But the truth of what had been uncovered was too much to bear. The DNA test, the discovery that his own father had fathered his children, had shattered the world he thought he knew. The pain of that revelation was so deep, so consuming, that it had driven him to a breaking point he hadn't known existed. As the detective sat across from him, the silence became unbearable. Daniel looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling as he slowly began to speak. I couldn't live with it, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know what to believe. Everything I thought was real was a lie. His words were choked with emotion, and he paused to wipe his eyes before continuing. I found out about the affair, about my father, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I looked at my kids and saw him in their faces. I saw his eyes, his smile, and I realized that all these years I had been raising children that weren't even mine. I thought that everything I had worked for, everything I believed in, was based on a lie. I couldn't live with it. I just couldn't. The detective sat still, his gaze fixed on Daniel, watching him unravel before him. Daniel's confession wasn't just about the crime. It was about the broken man sitting in front of him, a man who had been torn apart by the very family he had tried to protect. The detective had seen many confessions in his career, but this one was different. The anguish in Daniel's voice, the rawness of his emotions, left no doubt that he was struggling to comprehend the gravity of what had happened. I didn't know what to do, Daniel continued, his voice cracking. I was angry, so angry. And when I confronted Jessica, when she admitted the affair, I lost control. I never meant to hurt her. I never meant to do that, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop myself. Everything just came crashing down on me. The confession was slow and painful, as if each word was a weight that Daniel had to force from his chest. There was no justification for what he had done. No way to make sense of it. The brutality of his crime was undeniable, and yet the pain he spoke of, the confusion and anguish, was almost palpable. The detective leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. So you're telling me that what happened that day, what you did to your wife, that was all because of what you discovered about your father? Daniel nodded slowly, his face crumpling with emotion. Yes, I couldn't see straight. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I thought everything was ruined, my family, my faith. I couldn't handle it. I just lost it. And when she said it was true, I couldn't think. I couldn't stop myself. The detective sat back, letting the weight of Daniel's confession hang in the air. There was no quick answer, no way to make sense of the violence that had taken place. The act was incomprehensible, but the reasons behind it, no matter how twisted, were now laid bare. Daniel's world had collapsed, and in his desperation to make sense of the shattered pieces, he had committed an unforgivable act. The confession didn't come with any sense of redemption. No sign that Daniel would ever be able to undo the destruction he had caused. There was no solace to be found in his words, only a man who had lost everything: his family, his faith, his identity. He was a man undone, broken by the weight of a truth so unbearable that it had driven him to do the unthinkable. As the detective took in the gravity of the situation, Daniel's words echoed in his mind. He had confessed, yes, but the story was far from over. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many layers to this tragedy that needed to be unraveled. But in that moment, one thing was clear. The damage was done. The truth had been exposed, and Daniel's confession was only the beginning of the fallout that would follow. The camera zoomed in on Daniel's face, a close-up that captured every inch of his despair, his face etched with the knowledge of the devastation he had caused. His eyes were hollow, his expression distant, as if he had already checked out of the world he once knew. His confession had been more than just words. It was the final breakdown of a man who had been living a lie for far too long. And now there was no going back. The weight of Daniel Thompson's actions would not be easily swept away. In the aftermath of the horrific crime, the once respected preacher's life hung in the balance, torn between the severity of his actions and the story behind them. The arrest was only the beginning. Behind the walls of the courtroom, a different kind of battle began. One that would question the boundaries of justice, grief, and the dark consequences of betrayal. As Daniel sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, handcuffed and awaiting his fate, the shockwaves of his crime rippled throughout the small community of Pine Brook, Florida. A place once known for its warmth, tight-knit families, and Sunday mornings filled with hymns and prayers, was now at the center of a case that no one could have seen coming. The town divided. Some saw Daniel as a victim of circumstances, a man broken by the ultimate betrayal of a father who had been entrusted with the most sacred role of all, his family's protector. How could a man who had given so much to his community, who had preached of love and forgiveness, have fallen victim to such a terrible act? Was it the weight of betrayal that led him down this dark path? Was it the discovery of a hidden truth so devastating that it shattered his very identity? Others, however, were horrified by what had transpired. Jessica's brutal death could never be excused. Her family mourned her loss, the brutal way she had been taken from them, and the violent act that took away the woman they loved. How could anyone, no matter the circumstances, commit such an atrocity? And yet, in the midst of this moral divide, Daniel's fate was sealed by the law. The case quickly became the talk of Pine Brook, with every resident having an opinion on what should happen to Daniel. Some felt sympathy for the broken man, caught between the memories of a lifetime of lies and the pain of his personal torment. Others could not fathom how a father could destroy his family, no matter the depth of his sorrow. The whispers began to spread like wildfire. Was Daniel's father's betrayal enough to justify his actions, or had he simply lost his grip on reality? The trial, when it came, was as much a public spectacle as it was a legal proceeding. Local news outlets covered every moment, broadcasting images of the Thompsons' once perfect family, now shattered beyond recognition. The courtroom, filled with somber faces, became the battleground for arguments over the line between guilt and extenuating circumstances. Could a man's upbringing, the emotional and psychological trauma of growing up under the shadow of a family secret, ever justify the murder of a loved one? Throughout the trial, Daniel remained largely silent, his defense team focusing on the overwhelming emotional distress that had led him to act. They painted a picture of a man undone by betrayal, his world turned upside down, his perception of reality forever changed. It was a defense based not on justifying the crime, but on offering a glimpse of the agony that had pushed Daniel over the edge. The courtroom was filled with testimony, expert witnesses, and emotional appeals for mercy. But the prosecution stood firm. A crime had been committed, and no amount of pain or sorrow could change the fact that Jessica Thompson had been brutally murdered by the man who had once vowed to protect her. Legal experts questioned whether Daniel's defense would be enough to sway the jury. Was this a case of temporary insanity? Or was it the result of years of deep-seated emotional conflict, culminating in an act of violence that could not be undone? Could the long-buried truth about his father's deception provide any kind of legal reprieve? Or would it be seen as nothing more than an excuse for murder? The ripple effects of Daniel's crime were felt far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For Jessica's family, it was a tragedy they could never reconcile. They mourned not only the loss of their loved one, but the devastation that had torn apart a family that had once seemed perfect. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that the man who had killed Jessica was someone they had once trusted, a preacher, a father, a husband. The community itself was torn between sympathy and outrage, struggling to comprehend how a man so deeply embedded in their lives could commit such an unimaginable crime. For years, Daniel had been the moral compass of Pine Brook, a man who had preached about forgiveness, compassion, and faith. Yet now, his actions had exposed a stark and terrifying truth. Even the most righteous among us can be consumed by darkness. Images of the trial flashed before the public. Daniel, a broken figure sitting in the defendant's chair, his face pale, his eyes haunted by the weight of his actions. The courtroom was a silent battlefield, the tension almost unbearable as each piece of evidence was presented and each witness took the stand. A chilling scene unfolded, with the truth emerging slowly, like the layers of an onion being peeled away one by one. Yet no matter how many layers were uncovered, the heart of the tragedy, the brutal act of violence, could never be explained away. The jury would soon be tasked with determining whether Daniel's life would be forever shaped by the past, or whether he would face the full legal consequences of his crime. In the quiet aftermath, the echoes of the trial reverberated through the town. Pinebrook would never be the same again. The stain of Daniel's actions would hang over the community, a stark reminder of the hidden darkness that sometimes lurks in even the most familiar places. And for Daniel Thompson, there would be no return to the life he had known. The judgment would come, both from the legal system and from a community that had once held him in the highest regard. The story of Daniel Thompson, a man whose life seemed built on faith, community, and family, shattered the quiet town of Pinebrook in a way that no one could have ever anticipated. What began as a simple genealogical search would unravel the very fabric of his existence, leading to a brutal, life-altering crime. Betrayal, buried truths, and an overwhelming sense of anguish tore through his family, culminating in a horrific act of violence that no one could have foreseen. But beneath the surface of this tragic tale lies a question that remains unanswered. Could anything have justified the darkness that overtook Daniel? Was his crime born from a lifetime of pain, secrets, and shattered trust? Or was it the irreversible result of a man losing control, allowing his anger and heartbreak to consume him entirely? What if the weight of the past was simply too much to bear, and the discovery of his father's betrayal drove him into a place of unthinkable rage? The people of Pinebrook, and indeed the world, still struggle to reconcile the man Daniel once was with the man he became after that fateful day. The tragedy not only took a life, but it also forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths about what lies beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect families. Could anyone have seen this coming? Should someone have intervened sooner? And most chilling of all, how many more secrets like this are buried, hidden behind closed doors, waiting to break free? As the dust settles, the question remains, can a man ever truly escape the shadows of his past? Or is he forever defined by the choices he makes when those shadows finally catch up with him? Now we want to hear from you. Was Daniel's crime the result of an unbearable betrayal? Or was it an act of rage that cannot be excused, no matter the circumstances? What do you think? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. We value your perspective. And if this story captivated you, if you want to hear more unsettling and tragic tales like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a chilling story. Your voice matters and your curiosity fuels these stories. Thank you for joining us as we peel back the layers of a crime that shook a community to its core.